Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about regulatory and non-regulatory behaviors. So a regulatory behavior is behavior that's motivated to meet the survival needs of an animal or a person. It's controlled by homeostatic mechanisms which involve the hypothalamus. Examples include internal body temperature, eating and drinking, salt consumption, and waste elimination. So you and your body, you do these things automatically. Your brain doesn't need to think about it. Parts of your brain, automatic processing parts of your brain, homeostatic mechanisms, which primarily involve the hypothalamus, which involve a lot of hormone secretions. They provide the information for regulating your body temperature, when you should engage in eating and drinking, salt consumption, and waste. And I do want to point out that regulatory eating and drinking is primarily driven by when your body needs sustenance, and it is not comfort food, it is not eating for pleasure or preference. It is the fact that, all right, at a basic level, your body's going to need a certain amount of food and fluids to survive. Now, non-regulatory behavior, this is behavior that is unnecessary to meet the basic survival needs of an animal. So non-regulatory behaviors are not controlled by homeostatic mechanisms. Most non-regulatory behaviors involve the frontal lobes more than the hypothalamus, and most non-regulatory behaviors are strongly influenced by external stimuli. So examples of non-regulatory behaviors include sexual behavior, parenting behavior, aggression, food preference, curiosity, and reading. And these are all things that, while highly important, are not necessary for survival. So while sex is something that is important for the propagation of the species and for you passing on your genes, you don't actually need it to survive. Parental behavior, again, is something that is highly important and automatic in certain individuals for passing on particular genes. It's advantageous for us to engage in parental behavior, for us to have aggression towards particular people, for us to be curious about particular things, but these are not relevant to whether we, in this moment, are being able to survive or not. Food preference, again, so we have regulatory behaviors that are associated with food, but food preference, what we like or what we don't like to eat, is a non-regulatory behavior. So while I might tell my kids, for example, well, this is what we're having for dinner tonight, and they say, well, I don't like that. And as a parent, I can do one or two things. I can say, all right, well, what else do you like? And I can sort of really focus on their preferences, or I can say, well, that's it. This is what's for dinner. I can't satisfy everyone's food preferences, so if you're hungry, eat it, kind of thing. So we have food preferences, but food preferences and some of our habits with regards to eating, these are non-regulatory behaviors. The challenge is that food in particular has non-regulatory and regulatory aspects. And so some of the addictions surrounding food right now are particularly problematic because it's one of the few behaviors that has elements that are both regulatory and non-regulatory. And now I'm going to chat briefly about obesity. This is something that is highly relevant right now within the United States. Everyone should have concerns about obesity, aspects of health, the implications for becoming overweight or obese. Obesity is related to many, many health-related problems. And so a major question right now is elements of why there is this epidemic of obesity. It's not so much to just say, oh, there's so much food out there, that's the fault of the fast food places, they're tempting us with things. The actual answer to that is much, much more complicated. We're spending some time talking about it here because some of the things that you've learned in this course start to answer this more complicated question of why there is an obesity epidemic. For example, evolution favored preferring high-calorie foods. eating to capacity, storing fat, and using energy efficiently. This would have been highly advantageous. So for an individual, when during times were scarce, if they preferred high-calorie foods, then they would be more likely to seek out those calorie-rich foods in a scarce environment. When they encounter those foods, if they ate to capacity, then they would basically be engaging in behavior that would be storing some of this food or trying to gather as much food as they could or during a time of plenty so that the body would be able to survive during a time of scarcity. And the same thing goes for storing fat. So storing fat earlier on would have actually been advantageous. It would have been highly likely that just as animals do in preparing for hibernation, that they would eat a lot at particular times so that when fruit or vegetables or meat was less available, then they would have the fat that they would need to get them through these times of scarcity. One of the challenges is that right now, that in no way, shape, or form do we live in an environment where food or these types of resources are scarce. We also have cultural practices and beliefs that promote consumption. It was quite common when we were growing up to be sitting down at the table and you would have a plate of food and your parents would say, all right, well, you need to eat all of your dinner before you can have dessert. So even if we were full, it was a cultural practice to say, okay, you need to keep on eating. Eat more than would make you full before you would actually even eat dessert, which would be even more calories. So now, to give you an example of how rates of obesity have climbed in the past 20 years, we're going to go through some data that's provided by the CDC. And one of the things that I want to make clear about this data are these are self-reported rates of obesity. So this is in the year 1989, where basically on the whole there was no data or only 10 to 15% of the populations in these states self-reported being obese. If we go up to 1990, this continues, the light blue starts to get darker, and then it starts to get even darker in certain states, where again the obesity, self-reported obesity jumps from 15 to 19%. And then as we continue, we can start to get data on nearly all of the states, and the colors start to get darker blue, and then we move into light sort of orange, and here we start to have 20 to 24% within that state self-reported obesity. And then again we continue to moving on up into 2000s, and the rates of obesity are increasing, and now we're starting to see 25 to 29%. And as we continue, we move up into 2007, 2008. Now we're moving into some states reporting above 30% of self-reported obesity. 2009, 2010. Now we're transitioning here. In 2011, they actually changed some of the ways that they were gathering this data, and they realized, for example, that they needed to have more information from cell phones. And so it's difficult to compare the data that was before 2010 to the data that I'm about to show you, but you can still see that basically what they did is they started assessing data from not just landlines, but also cell phones and the more types of communication that were available. And so see here in 2011, again, this is still self-reported obesity, that we have we have the green states reporting between 20 and 25% self-reported obesity, the yellow states reporting between 25 and 30% self-reported obesity, and then we have orange states that are 30 to 35%. So the colors change, but the actual high values still remain very, very high. And one thing that I want to point out is this is self-reported obesity. So what this means is that someone is telling someone else that they're obese. And so that's actually even harder for some people to think about. They might say to themselves, well, I'm overweight, but I'm not obese. So it's quite likely that the numbers of actual obesity are much, much higher than self-reported obesity. So if we move from 2011 to 2012, you see similar numbers. And then it starts to increase even more in 2013, that you have some states that are reporting over 35% of self-reported obesity. These numbers basically continue to get higher. So why do some people become obese while others don't? One basic reason would be energy input differences. People differ in terms of their craving for high-calorie foods. There's also cultural norm differences, and people can have a large cephalic phase response to the sight and smell of food. Basically, what this would mean is we talked about how some non-regulatory behaviors are highly stimulated by external stimuli. So people could have a high sort of external stimuli responsivity. That means that if they were to see food or if they were to smell food, they would be highly, highly responsive to that. And then it would be harder for them to resist actually eating some of the food that they see or that they smell. We also have energy output differences. People differ in terms of the physical activity that they engage in. 2 hours and 30 minutes of moderate to intense aerobic activity, i.e. brisk walking, every week, and muscle strengthening activities on 2 or more days a week that will work all major muscle groups. This is what is required for basic health, not, or stepping towards optimal health. This is not like, oh, you got to keep yourself in peak shape. 2 hours and 30 minutes of moderate intense aerobic activity and muscle strengthening activity are basically the basic framework that you need for the level of physical activity that would be putting yourself in a position of being in good health. Not great health, not excellent health, but good health. A lack of physical activity is now being equated to cigarettes or smoking cigarettes. If you don't engage in enough physical activity, this can be very, very detrimental on your body. As human beings, we are not designed to be as passive and inactive as we are. We have never been so inactive in the history of our development as we are right now. Even if we were to look back 100, 200 years, all of the activity would require us to be much more physically active. We would have had to walk to various places. We would have had to do more to get access to resources. So now, more than any other time, we can be inactive, yet still have access to everything. This is a really, really unhealthy cultural and environmental circumstance for us. We also know that genetics interacts with both energy input and energy output. So in addition to environmental differences, the genes that we have are going to affect our energy input differences, how we crave foods, how we react to cultural norms, and how we respond to the sight and smell of food. And we're also going to have genetics that interact with physical activity. So we might be more likely with some genes to actually burn a few more calories than in others. So genetics interacts with both input and output. So we know that we have these problems, and because we know these problems, we've tried for the past 10, 20, 30 years to attempt to lose weight. So why are some of the weight loss programs that we engage in or behaviors typically ineffective? One is that we are evolutionary programmed to store fat, and two, long-term weight loss requires a permanent lifestyle change. And this is something that lots of people really don't want to actually think about or accept. They think, well, I really want to be able to eat whatever I want to eat and have there be some quick solution so that I don't actually gain weight. There's no evidence to suggest that anything like this exists. That if we're going to be eating unhealthy foods in excess, or even if we're eating unhealthy foods in moderation, most people think of moderation as actually being, well, I can eat a moderate amount. That actually seems like more. Really, when you have cookies or you have chips, you should actually be eating a small amount. Only a small amount would be acceptable. But some of that is not the cultural norms that we're setting up, and we really don't like to think that, well, look, these foods that are so yummy, I won't be able to eat them. And of course, the environment that we're in with regards to fast food, quick access to cheap food, the cheapest food tends to be the least healthy food. So it's really, really challenging to actually make some of the permanent lifestyle change that would set a person up for good health. but it's becoming more and more necessary for us to really try to make these commitments for ourselves and for our children, because the health problems that are associated with weight gain and obesity are just astronomically challenging. Another challenge is that exercise can also make you hungry. Often people eat more calories after they work out than they've burned during the workout. So some people, particularly when they're younger and they have a higher metabolism, will work out just so that they can eat whatever they want to. That is not a mental framework that is all helpful for engaging in healthier behaviors. So you really want to exercise to promote good health, and you really want to make food choices to promote good health. You want to eat healthy items and exercise, not to sort of eat whatever unhealthy foods that you want to, but exercise so that you can engage in healthier habits that make you and your body feel good. And after you exercise, you really want to be mindful of what you're eating. Lots of people don't actually know how many calories are in some of the food that they're eating. So it's a really good investment of your time to go through one of those calorie counting programs for just a week to say, all right, how many calories are actually in what I eat? Not even trying to regulate them, but just informing yourself, all right, and typically what I eat in terms of chicken nuggets or chicken strips, breakfast sandwich, chips, quesadilla, wrap, how many calories are actually in a hamburger? There are hundreds of calories, and most people don't actually realize. So if you are informed about what is actually in the food that you're eating, then you can make steps to engage in healthier eating choices. There are a number of disorders that are also associated with eating behaviors that are problematic. Anorexia and bulimia nervosa are some of the two most common eating disorders. Anorexia is voluntary self-starvation. This is fatal in 10% of patients. So anorexia involves restricting yourself from food, and you can engage in such extreme restriction that you don't actually eat the number of calories that your body needs to survive, and you can die. Bulimia, this is binging and purging. People who have bulimia can typically actually exhibit normal weight, but their habits around food are really, really unhealthy. Sometimes the two disorders actually have similar symptoms, and they can be difficult to distinguish. So both anorexia and bulimia are associated with distorted body image, and they're also associated with obsessive compulsive disorder and depression. So it's important to try to identify and be familiar with some of the signs and symptoms of anorexia and bulimia, so that if you identify them in friends or loved ones or associates, then you might be able to try to find out some of the things that you can do to help them. To give you some examples of how people can have anorexia or bulimia and yet still appear as if they didn't, and how they can be engaging in many normal behaviors, they can be hiding aspects of their food disorder behaviors, their food restriction, or their binging and purging. There's a number of links here to BBC's Desperately Hungry Housewives, and so these can be interesting to watch in terms of learning more about these types of behaviors. And this then marks the end of Chapter 12. So please go through and watch any of these videos that you would like to at your leisure. The links are available via the posted slides.